right, welcome back, welcome back, welcome back to the Better Not Bitter podcast. I am your host, Maya Warren, and today we have another episode and another amazing guest. But before we get into that, please make sure you like, comment, subscribe, tell a friend to tell a friend, and so we can keep the mission of this podcast going. Without further ado, let's drop that intro.
Are you picking up what I'm putting down? I'm on a mission, hopes in my line of vision. Are you picking up what I'm putting down? I'm on a mission, hopes in my line of vision.
All right, so today we have, as I said before, a special guest with us by the name of Dr. BJ Miller. But before I even attempt to introduce him, I would like to give him an opportunity to introduce himself.
Hello, Maya. Hi, everybody. So I'm BJ. I'm a fellow human. I am, I suppose I qualify as a person with a disability since I was 19. I grew up in Chicago, moved around a lot. Now I live in just north of San Francisco, and my profession is this little field in medicine called hospice and palliative medicine. And so my whole professional life is really about this phrase quality of life and sort of being true to life's inevitabilities like illness or death or all sorts of fun stuff, and trying to make sense of that, trying to work with reality is really my job.
That's awesome. Such a great introduction. You briefly mentioned your introduction or, touch point with disability at the age of 19. Would you care to kind of elaborate on that?
Yeah. So for me, I was a sophomore in college. This was back in 1990. And some friends of mine and I were just screwing around one night, and we climbed a parked commuter train. I was just sitting there. I wasn't moving. We didn't really think it was anything particularly dangerous. We just climbed it like you climb a tree. But what I didn't realize is the way that train was powered is the wires run overhead. And so when I got up on top of the train and when I stood up, I had a metal watch on my left wrist. And when I got close enough to the power source, the electricity arced to the watch, and that was it. A big old explosion, and came very close to death. And from electrical burns, ended up losing both legs below the knee and my left arm below the elbow. And that was that.
Wow. Wow. That is definitely a unique story in terms of being introduced into the community that we call disability. So that kind of brings me into how I kind of was introduced to, who you are as a physician and individual. A mentor of mine by the name of Pastor Roy Dockery, who's an executive, does all the things. He sent me your podcast episode, and I believe it was entitled, is death really a death sentence, or does death have to be a death sentence? So to speak. And a lot of the points that you made in there got me thinking, and with the way that my mind works, I always bring it around to disability. And so one of the things I do as an advocate, I continuously fight to challenge the notion that disability is a death sentence. Would you mind kind of talking about your experience with disability and how you may have kind of come to, challenge those ideals yourself?
Yeah, Maya. So really my I don't know, exploration journey, life with disability really began before my own experiences, per se, before I became disabled. I grew up with a mother who had polio. As a child, she had polio, and then later in her life had what's called post-polio syndrome, and which means essentially there's a progressive disability that started in her 40s. She's still with us. She is almost 80 now,
Okay.
And from post-polio syndrome, it's just progressive disability. When I was a child, she wore a brace and walked on crutches. And then when I was about 10 or 11, she started using a wheelchair more and more. And now it's to the point where electric wheelchair, but most of the time actually in bed. There's a lot to say about mom, but back to your question, I got exposed as a child. You know, my whole life has been around disability one way or another. Which was a great advantage for me in ways I bet you can imagine. As I myself entered the ranks of the disabled, I was already pre-washed. You know, I already knew, thanks to my mom's experience and being around her and watching how the world treated her. I knew, you know, I understood a lot. And I also understood through her eyes the disability rights movement. And I
Mm-hmm.
grew up with the notion of disability as a civil rights issue. And so you know, I'm so lucky to have absorbed that. I think a lot of my friends, like in rehab, when we were, you know, they had not been exposed to disability as a younger person, and they had to go through this period of hating their lives or hating themselves or feeling less than, and all those cues that we know well hit home in ways for others that really didn't for me on some level. You know, I didn't ever really buy into that you're cool if you've got 4 limbs, or you're cool if you weigh so and so, or you're cool if your skin color is sex. I that just as a young that never I was so lucky to never absorb that notion into my bones as a young person. So, um, you know, by the time it was my turn to step into these shoes, you know, I could kind of hit the ground running, as it were. I didn't, when I got back to college, I switched my focus to art, to studying art and art history, because I love art. You might meet my cat here in a second, Maya. We'll see. He
No
likes
problem.
doing these things. Come on, buddy. Come on. Anyway, yeah, art. So I decided to study art as I was coming out of the burn unit and re-entering the world, re-entering school, um, because I got really interested in this idea of like, well, what does make a human being a human being, and why do people make art? Why do people make things from their experiences? It seems
Mm-hmm.
such an unusual thing for our species does. And anyway, I learned a lot by studying the sort of creative process, and I came to see life as a creative process.
Mm-hmm.
Daily life, like we're improving all the time, we're making stuff up, we're making our way. So it was really with that kind of mindset that I entered these shoes, and knew enough that this disability thing was something to work with, not to
Mm-hmm.
put behind me or overcome or pretend to put behind me or pretend to overcome it, I should say, because how do you put something like this behind you? It's, you know, it's a daily deal. So then off I went. And I don't mean to make it sound pat or easy, but there were all sorts of peaks and valleys, of course, and it took me years to really settle into these shoes.
Mm-hmm.
But that was that creative lens, and that sort of philosophical one. I'll shut up here in a second, Maya. You asked one
Yeah,
question. I'm
no,
going on. Sorry. But it's just one moment that just really stands out to me, and I love telling this story. When I was on this hunch, going back to school and studying art history, I remember I was sitting we were studying uh, ancient statues, old Greek stuff. And, you know, you've probably seen there are these old, beautiful old statues, and they're
Mhm.
missing an arm or a leg because over the 2,000 years, whatever, things happen. And, you know, we're sitting here studying this sculpture and cooing at it and loving it and thinking how beautiful it is. And I'm sitting there in the
Mhm.
audience, freshly in these shoes and not really clear what I really thought about my life just yet. And I remember looking at these statues and being, hey, they look a lot like me. No one in the audience was sitting there going, well, this would be a really nice statue if it had, you know, 2 arms.
Mhm.
That was, you know, so it just taught me the power of context and how we can set our context, set our frame. So anyway, that's something of an answer to your, or at least a start to an answer to your question.
Yeah, and you hit on a lot of key points.
Hmm.
And one thing that really stood out to me is when you specifically said that disability is something to work with. Because, you know, a little bit of my story growing up with albinism, which is a lack of pigmentation in my eyes, hair, and skin, for those who do not know. And that is often accompanied by a vision impairment. So no one told me what I had. And so I had to take it upon myself to do all the research. And then 8th grade is when I became an advocate in that regard. And so just navigating all of the throws, mind you, had a disability since birth. I've seen so many people, not just in my own experience, but the people I come in contact with, who either been disabled since birth or get their introduction to disability after birth. And it's very interesting because, you know, I'm a black woman. So we talk about in the Black community that Blackness or African American culture is not a monolith. And I think the same is with disability, how we respond to the introduction of disability, how we navigate life thereafter, how we communicate, how we see ourselves. And I've noticed the common thread of internalized ableism. It's a powerful thing. And I almost view it as this machine that we all, it seems like it's a part of the package deal at times that we ingest it. And so we run into obstacles like, oh, I feel like a burden for asking for this accommodation, or I feel like I'm an inconvenience because I need more than the average individual. And I bring that up to say, in my own experience with navigating and unpacking internalized ableism in my life, one thing I've had discussions with my mentors and friends about is the idea that we need to reframe what disability is entirely. It's seen as something to be pitied, something to dread, something that is almost like a curse. I was, for those who don't know, I'm in Orlando at a conference that I'm speaking at, and I was calling an Uber, and the Uber's like, "Where are you?" And I was like, "Well, I'm visually impaired, so I can't really tell you. I'm new to this area." And he was like, "Oh, I'm sorry." And I was like, "There's no need for you to apologize. Like, I've been visually impaired my entire life." And so even moments like that, I didn't have time to like nitpick and explain it. But even in that regard, reframing disability. In your work of hospice care, you specialize in teaching people how to live with their conditions and navigate the time that they have. Could you talk about how both reframing disability and taking that palliative care approach can kind of help us reframe disability?
Yeah, beautiful, Maya. I'm really with you. You know, even the word disability, like what is it? What's the you know, who's the standard thing that we're being compared to? And once you kind of key into that question, it really opens things up in a lot of ways. We just sort of presuppose that a normal person is X, Y, or Z. But who says? Who I mean, I remember it's been a while, but I've had a few moments where with school kids where I used to every once in a while I'd go speak in schools about this or that, and almost invariably it hasn't come up in a while, but oftentimes a kid would say, "Well, yeah, but don't you miss having two hands and something like that, you know?" And I'd say, "Well, yeah, two hands was cool. I enjoyed that. That was nice." And then I'd say something like, "Well, don't you miss having three hands?" You know, and they'd look at me like, "What?" You know, and then sometimes I'd watch a little light bulb go off like, like when I used to have four limbs, I didn't sit around going, "If only I had five, life would be great." You know? And it's, you know, it's like a playful rhetorical trick, but it makes your point that the whole thing needs to be reframed and can be reframed. It's not asking too much because the whole thing is made up in the first place. I mean, this is a made up notion. You know, it is a construct. It is not some God-given, nature-made kind of idea that, well, there's the disabled and the able-bodied. No. That's us making stuff up. So once we see that we human beings are the source of both this sort of suffering that comes from who's inside, who's outside the line, we're the ones placing the line. So at first it's kind of devastating that we hurt each other with our words. We hurt each other with our constructs. We hurt ourselves, holding ourselves against impossible things. But then at some point you kind of come to the realization, and it sounds like you did at a very young age, where, hey, these lines are made up. I'm going to move that line. I'm going to say where my line is, who we all get to say. So then it becomes this sort of opening, this creative charge that we can place our lines where we want. So anyway, just to sort of, really, I love your point there. And it's really true. And this is why I love your podcast. This is why I love just these kinds of conversations, because people will tune in. These things need to be learned. I don't know if it was obvious to you until you had your own experiences in the world as a younger person. And certainly, even of all my experiences with my mother, it took me a while to be in my own shoes to really get it and really own what we're talking about here. So anyway, so I'm just glad we're all talking about these things. This is why I wear shorts. This is why I'm out. You got to be out of the closet.
Yeah, and even in that regard, so I live with three chronic illnesses as well, so invisible disabilities. And so whereas albinism and my vision impairment, like I've had it all my life, I was kind of used to it, even though I dealt with some other things, but with the introduction of chronic illness is when I really struggled. Like I genuinely struggled because I had already had a chip on my shoulder of feeling like I had to prove myself as a Black individual with no pigmentation who was visually impaired. And so getting over that hump, or so to speak, and then bam, here comes a debilitating chronic illness that has derailed my 5 to 10 year plan, all of the things that I saw for myself. And so I really struggled with denial. We talk about the stages of grief that people with disabilities often navigate and on a reoccurring basis most of the time. And I navigated denial to the nth degree. Like I just refused to believe that this chronic illness was touching every area of my life. And once I got to a place through therapy and, the abandonment of my faith and, community, all these things, which community I'm a big proponent of. It became clear to me, like the only way forward was finding some way to address this. And for me, being an artist in multiple disciplines, like I found ways to do it through music. I found ways to do it through writing, through visual art, and navigating it from that perspective has really helped me reframe, what it's like to live with chronic illness. And I'm reading an amazing book by Megan O'Rourke, and it's called The Invisible Kingdom. And in it, she's talking about this invisible kingdom of living with disabilities that are not apparent to the naked eye. And she goes on to describe the current American medical system as it stands, where we are looked at, patients often go through this process where treatment or medicinal intervention is pursued from the perspective of we got to cure it or diagnose it. And if, like most of us in the invisible disability and even in the chronic pain or disability communities in general, if it's not seen, if the tests come back normal, if we're not presenting with typical symptoms, then guess what? It can't be seen, right? So in it, she describes what would be called the palliative care or the live with it approach. Like, how can we manage life with these instances? My question to you is, in terms of patients, as people with disabilities and illnesses, we're patients ultimately. In terms of people navigating the medical system, what do you think is a more pragmatic view in terms of how the medical system should be framed in light of disability and chronic illness?
Such a beautiful point. I mean, this is in the medical system, I think is there's such an interesting, fraught relationship between the medical world and the world of disability, which seems ironic, perhaps. I mean, I'm sure you and I have spent a lot of time with doctors and in hospitals. And in my case, my life was saved by doctors and hospitals. I mean, there's no doubt about it. So I have a lot of, these are complex issues. I have complex feelings around it.
Mm-hmm.
But I think the key is what you've pointed to it, which is and this is what I try to do when I teach in medical schools and have been involved in with curriculum development and stuff. And you try to, it's okay to call the medical system a model, the medical model. It's a model, not to be confused with the totality of reality. All models are, someone said, all models are wrong. Some are just more useful than others.
Mm-hmm.
And that's true, right? I mean, models are distillations, reductions. Things get left out. We choose words, we choose a vernacular, and things flow from that, good and bad, from those words. And to your point, medicine is always pathologizing things. So for the last 170 years, sort of medical history has been this sort of scientific method is, name the issue, call it a problem, and go to war with that problem,
Mm-hmm.
and sometimes you win those wars. I mean, but plenty of time you don't. And even if you don't win the war, in this case being fixed or cured, there's fallout from that structure, that way of seeing. And on the receiving end as a patient, if a doctor's looking at me like I'm pathological, that and medicine focuses on diseases. This is another key thing to understand. It is built around to focus on illness and disease, not on people who live with illness and disease, which really
Mm-hmm.
explains a lot that how it feels to be a patient. We're homogenized, we're put in these gowns, we're given this sort of bland food, and we get referred to by our illness. Oh, the guy with heart disease in room 12 or whatever.
Mm-hmm.
And so the key here is, and all of that, okay, we got to pick words. We have to have a model. We have to have so it's this complex stuff. We have to understand what we mean by this or that word in this medical system. Okay, fine. Just if everyone just paused and realized it was, like we're talking about disability, that it was a construct, that it's a model, that it's a made up thing. And don't confuse the made up thing with the big thing. Don't confuse medicine with the medical model with the totality of reality. I know I'm repeating myself a little bit, but these are sort of really, really key things. So I'm talking about, and answer your question, is the work, whether you're a clinician trying to do better work or a patient trying to receive the care that you actually need, that actually serves you. I think step one is, or early step is, to realize what you're dealing with, and don't don't buy into the language. You are not pathological because you have an illness or disability. That pathology is just a convention for people to understand what they're talking about and to work on it.
Mm-hmm.
So that's big one. That's a big one, because this starts getting at our identity and where you start feeling all the feelings that go with being treated that way. And so that's one big thing. And then to your point, we have to realize, as seductive as medical science has been, as powerful as it has been, suffering, death, these things persist. Even if we cure heart disease, is number one killer of human beings. Okay, even when we cure heart disease or when we cure cancer, well, there's going to be something else waiting around the bend. Nature's going to have her way.
Mm-hmm.
And so just to realize this sort of quixotic battle of trying to create this perfect, again, who's perfect? What the hell does that mean even?
Right.
To say. But even if we're sticking with this medical model, call everything a problem, go to war with, and even can win all those wars, at some point, something's going to come along that's not fixable, that's not winnable. And
Yeah.
oftentimes, even beyond that, I have worked with a ton of people who have said, even when they have something that's treatable or fixable, they may opt out of it. You know what? I like the way I am. Or I'm
Mm-hmm.
tired of your damn treatments. Or I
Mm-hmm.
want to be in the park, not the hospital. And you know what, doctor? No matter what you say or do, you're going to die too, pal. So, time is limited. And so I'm going to spend my time how I want it. I'm not sure you guys are anywhere near curing death. And by the way, I've not met many people who would really want to never die. We have movies about this. Those are vampire movies. These are,
Mm-hmm.
zombies. That's the people who don't die. So anyway, I'm going on and on here, but so these are, so one is this sort of mental frame shift to understand this model is a model. Don't confuse it. Don't buy into it too much. And then for everybody involved to realize that it's someday we're all beyond cure. We're all beyond fixing. And if healthcare, if medicine could see itself working on behalf of humanity, not on behalf of stamping out illness, well, then we would never, as a doctor, I would never say to you, Maya, I'm so sorry, there's nothing we can do. I would say, Maya, well, maybe that vision isn't going to change. We may not be able to change how you see, but boy, I'm not leaving your side. Let's see what is possible. Or, come back and see me. Let's talk it out. Or that's a very different thing to say, sorry, Maya, there's nothing we can do. Good luck out there.
Yes. And in my experience, like I've had countless, like, 'cause I with one of my chronic illnesses, I have the rare version of chronic migraine disease, which is status migrainosus. Only about 1% of the migraine population have it, which means no medicinal intervention touches it. And so it's been like having one migraine bout for the last 10 years. And so the interesting thing is I recently was told that by a physician. They were like, yeah, we've exhausted all treatment. There's nothing we can do for your chronic migraines. And I smiled. And I smiled, and it was weird to me because I had like a piece about it, because I got to a point where I just kind of settled into this, like, well, I'm living with it. I'm navigating it without these medications that were making it worse. And for whatever I'm called to do, I will be given the strength to do just that and nothing more. And I think in my journey, that's a big step. To go from denial to that, that's something that, I had to, I'm learning to celebrate the small wins. But even in that regard, you mentioned, the medical model and not buying into it in terms of internalizing that gaslighting at times. It brought to mind this question of, for those of us with disabilities and for those without, I don't know if you've ever experienced this, but oftentimes you may tell someone, oh yeah, I got this, and they're like, oh, and I've come to figure out that oh, or someone's perception of my disability is attributed to their quick mental cognitive appraisal, and which is usually lows something like this, where oh, you have this disability, you just told me about it, and then they quickly imagine themselves with said disability, and the limited quality of life they perceive that I have, that they think they would have if they had my situation. And so in the split millisecond that they've thought that, here comes oh. And so my question to you is, with regard to those cognitive appraisals where people kind of sympathetically, not empathetically, put on your disability in that millisecond, what is a better approach to empathizing with people who have a disability?
Great question. Man, there's so much to talk about in here. I mean, it's like, first of all, I just want to pick up on your idea of gaslighting, as you had said before. Like, if there's a diagnosis for it, it exists. If there isn't a code for it, it's on you. Like, doctors do this all the time, accidentally or otherwise. If you're not meeting the books, then you're the problem. And that sucks. And that is gaslighting. And to me, that's the new mega negligence, is denying somebody their reality just because you don't understand it, or just because blah blah blah. That is, I'm not sure there's a greater negligence anywhere. And anyway, so that, I just want to herald what you were pointing to a moment ago, Maya. That happens a lot.
I've experienced it a lot.
Yeah, I bet. And man, yeah. So I just want to note that. And back to your question. Also, well, before I get to your question, when you said that smile, was that smile for yourself when you realized that you had moved from denial to this living with mode?
That's a good question. I think it was for me. I think in that split second, I had a cognitive appraisal of my own, where it was just like, oh, like, in years past when doctors said that to me, it really impacted me, and it made me
Mhm.
feel like I had something, like I was out of my mind, or as they say, it's all in your head.
Mhm.
But this time I was like, no,
Mhm.
I'm good. And I should mention, around this time, I just came into a working relationship with an amazing physician who, for the first time in my medical journey, in terms of a physician, I felt seen and heard and believed. So I
Mm.
think the combination of that community, my journey of faith, my journey with therapy and mental health, all of those things kind of contributed to that smile, which ended up being a win for me.
Ah, beautiful. Well, beautiful. Yeah, and I think I'm to build on that and back to your question. Let's think through together what is the right sort of empathetic response. But before we get there, I've had those moments of a smile come over my face too, even when I'm bumping up against something that's pretty lame. It's sort
Hmm.
of like, and that, like, oh, I'm actually done with this issue. I've moved. I've worked through this one. And then anyway, that smile is lovely. It's one you can't help. It just comes on your face. Anyway,
Hmm.
um, so one of the things that as you move through and as you grow with all this stuff, at some point you move from absorbing all this I'm pathological, I'm less than, I'm sorry for my existence, to when I meet that awe thing, I'm just, and to your point, I think that's exactly what's going on. This sort of quick projection. They
Hmm.
put themselves in your shoes, which is humans do. That is a kind of empathy. But then they have this kind of lame response to empathy, which is be like, "Ugh, I don't think I could deal with that. Wouldn't want to, And you can just watch it happen. And
Hmm.
part of the smile that I'll get in those moments now, it used to offend me, but now I'm just like, oh, you poor thing. You think you've got all your stuff together? You think I don't, and you think you've got all your stuff together and you're just flying high and all your stuff doesn't stink. Okay, my friend. Good luck to you. You've got a long way to fall. And maybe you and I, maybe in one way of understanding disability, especially in the world that we're living in, is that you learn how to fall.
Hmm.
Um, Sometimes it's the world pushing you down, sometimes whatever, one way or another, you learn how to fall and you learn how to get back up. And some of the people I feel most sorry for are people who have really not learned how to fall, or nothing's really gone wrong. Something will gone wrong, something will. And then, boy, then they're really a mess. So
Yeah.
part of my smile back to them is, don't be fooling yourself into thinking that you've got everything together, and because it could change, and you and I know this could change in a nanosecond.
Yeah, yeah, and in that statement, that last statement, it can change in a nanosecond. Leads me
Mm,
to my next question, and is that, given my experience and your experience with disability, we both kind of navigated it, with an awareness of the fragility of life and how quickly things can change. Like, even with me with chronic illness, like I
mhm,
have a functional migraine right now, but in two
mm,
seconds I could be experiencing an uptick in vestibular symptoms. So just even with one condition, and I have three,
mm,
and like, so life is very volatile. And even in our society, a friend of mine, we're talking about this, we've made life so disposable. So
mm,
when we consider that and the fragility of life, and how we as people with disabilities kind of impose that fragility on those that we meet, whether we intend to or not,
mhm,
'cause I find that people are forced to reckon with, oh wow, like I'm uncomfortable in this moment because I can't fix what I perceive is, something to be fixed of you.
mhm.
With all that considered, how do or what do you think is an effective approach to sitting in that uncomfortability that comes with recognizing our human fragility?
Mhm. Yeah. Well, I think it is one of the great skills that humans are ever called to learn, to sit, to really be present with something that they can't fix, with suffering that they can't change, pain that they can't make go away, you know, with sitting with all the things that they can't control.
Mhm.
I think that is very hard to do. And we humans, we have this thing called an imagination. You know, we could always imagine a world, a life better than the one we got,
Mm-hmm.
you know? And this is where I think that can be a source, this imagination can become a source of torture and
Mm.
constantly be pulling you away from the reality that you actually have. And there's some tension in there. I think as we as a species and as individuals, I know that I often strive. I'm trying to change things. I'm trying to change this or that in my life. I'm trying to change a healthcare system. What Yeah, I am. And but I think the trick is to realize I may never get there, but participating in that, actively working towards a world that includes more people. You know, you can judge a system by how many things that are left out of it. The
Mm.
strongest system I could imagine would leave the fewest things out of it. That would be a model that really actually does reality a service.
Mm.
So, as I want to work towards that, I'm striving. I am trying to change things.
Yeah.
Okay. The trick is to learn how to know how to not hinge not your happiness on whether or not things outside your control actually change. You can
Mm.
do your part. You can be activated. There's an activation, as you know, as an activist. There's a charge. It gets you out of bed in the morning. And that has to do with a world that needs some changing. So you have to kind of be a little bit disgruntled to be motivated to do something about it, and a little bit joyful to realize why we're doing this in the first place. You have to have you have to have some emotional nuance. You got to be able to move from sorrow to joy.
Mm-hmm.
And that is a really key, powerful skill to learn in this life. And I'm back to your question. So yes, we can try to change this or that thing, but ultimately that's a little different than hanging our sense of self or our
Yeah.
worthiness on the outcome. I'll be happy if X, Y, or Z happens, but until
Mm.
then, oh man, I get how that works. You sound like it's like leverage in that. I'm not going to let myself feel good until I get an A on a test or something.
Mm.
I used to do that all the time. Just yeah, right.
I
But
get it.
but that's a trick. That's a distortion, and at the end of the day, and that's why I love hanging around folks who are older and people who are near the end of life, is because they're living proof. They've had to accommodate reality that they wish were otherwise. And
Mm-hmm.
when you do that, and you do that consciously, you come to a peace, and you come to
Mm-hmm.
realize there are forces way bigger than you. And that's kind of beautiful. It may be humbling, but I don't mind a little humble pie. That stuff is useful stuff. Humble pie is kind of delicious.
Yeah.
So there's this tension here again, and I just want to name that tension because I don't think the tension should go away. I like the tension. I
Mm-hmm.
just know that someday, at some point, I'm going to rest. I'm going to put that tension down, and I'm going to dissolve into the universe that cares about me, but no more or less than any other living thing within it. And that's going to be enough for me. So, wow, I don't even remember what your question was, Maya. I am
Oh,
chatty
you
this
answered
morning, but
it.
okay.
You answered my question, and you said something in there about older adults
Mm,
who are either near the end of life or they've kind of deteriorated in terms of physical ability and mobility.
mm-hmm,
And I have a special place in my heart for older adults just because I've been around them all my life. And I've been, awkwardly named the old soul in all my friend groups, even though I'm
mm,
24.
mm,
But one of the things that I have observed is that peace for most of them, like despite having, conditions like gout or maybe Alzheimer's, like there's this odd peace. And I call it
mhm,
odd because it's foreign unless you kind of position yourself in that form of humility. Because we talked about falling, everyone falls, and I think the difference between the height of that fall is humility and thinking that you all have it all together.
mhm. Right on. Yes.
And so I think the common thread of that is resilience, especially in my culture.
Mm,
Black Americans were the key contributors to the civil rights movement as well as the disability rights movement.
mhm,
And even though credit was far from given,
mhm,
to see how they continue to pave the way regardless. And even in my own experience, watching other people with disabilities and without in my own culture and community, navigate situation after situation with resilience and, you know, having experienced trauma in my background, learning that there's generally two responses to these nanosecond changes that occur in life, and that's responding from a place of anxiety and a place of peace. And I think more and more in my own journey, I'm learning to respond from that place of peace.
Well, beautiful, Mayia. You are ahead of the curve, my friend. And most people I know, I mean, that, you know, that's a piece you earn. That doesn't just plop on your lap. At least in my experience. Maybe you tell me, but that seems like a hard-earned piece. And in your case, how does it relate to like we were talking about wanting to change things? You're an activist too. So how do you reconcile being peace with, which I would say sort of has something to do with being okay with how things are, and activism with wanting to change how things are?
Yeah, so naturally as an advocate or activist,
oh, I'm sorry, which word do you prefer? And
it doesn't matter to me. I've been called both. So
okay.
I just know that part of my purpose is creating change, and whatever that title is, I guess it fits. And so for me, I was doing a recording for an ADA celebration with Disability Inclusion Organization from North Carolina. And the question was asked to me, oh, how do you feel about how far we've come? And so, as truthful as I could be, I was like, I mean, we've come a very mighty long way. However, we have a long way to go. And even from there's always the temptation as an American where we can just focus on how issues and themes affect us as Americans, but I don't settle for that. I'm not satisfied until people with disabilities on a global scale are recognized and treated with dignity. And so I said that, and they were like, oh yeah. And you know, I processed what I said after the fact, and I'm like, Mayia, are you ever satisfied? Kind of like Hamilton, will I ever be satisfied? And I don't find satisfaction in what I do. I don't find satisfaction in my purpose. I find satisfaction in my faith. But in addition to that, how can I say it? I feel fulfilled when I am creating solutions. So whether that's with a large scale of people or one-on-one, one of my mantras, so to speak, when I first started advocating was one person at a time. Because it would be overwhelming if we just took, say, albinism. There's so many issues, and I am one person. I cannot possibly reach every single person attached to this sphere of albinism. That would just be, I would burn myself out. And so focusing on the quality of the actions I take, the impact I desire to create, and also relying on interdependence, realizing that I don't have to take on every cause, even within one community, recognizing like if there's someone else operating in that cause in a perspective that I want to kind of aid in, like I can come alongside them. That's why I collaborate with various organizations, because a lot of times they're already doing things that I've seen a need for, but I need to provide, you know, aid and maybe outreach, like spreading the word about what they do. And so finding ways to see areas of need and fill them, but fill them in ways that I'm also taking care of myself. Because with 3 chronic illnesses and a vision impairment, like if I am going overboard, then I can't, you know, be of service to anyone, not even myself. So learning to sit myself down at times and take sabbaticals, which I do often, from things like social media and even speaking engagements, and being willing to say, okay, the world is not on fire. This will get done when it needs to get done. But for now, just learning to rest. So I hope that answered your question.
I did, man. That is beautiful. I'm learning this one. It's like a work in progress. I suppose so much of life is a work in progress. You know,
and it's the same for me. Like there are some days where I'm like, oh, I gotta act, and then I have to be like, calm down.
But how, it's such a really, to me, it's such a rich ongoing question of how does anyone right size themselves in this
Mhm.
world? I am one person,
Yeah.
like you're saying. That's different. That's one, not zero, not
Yeah.
1,000. I'm one. So I need to both not talk myself out. I need to both sort of own my littleness, just one of a gazillion,
Mhm.
and my bigness, that that there are repercussions to what I do. I can affect things. I am here. And that right sizing question, it's been a tricky one for me, especially in work where you are in front of issues and sufferings that are enormous, that I know there's only so much I can do before this pile of pain.
Mhm.
So how do I manage to feel okay about my efforts, knowing I could always do more? You know, um, it's been a tricky thing for me, and sometimes I've tipped into really a kind of self abdication, a kind of a service that actually is much more of a retreat from myself. Oh no, I don't need anything. I'll just give, give, give.
Yeah.
This is all over the healing professions, health professions has this all over it. And a lot
Mhm.
of those scarred down, gnarly doctors that you might meet actually at once were probably the most kind, sweetest people on the planet, but
Mhm.
it's just too much sometimes,
And
you know?
to your point, um, what impacted me, and I've always struggled with resting as a person who I'm
Hmm.
a recovering perfectionist.
Hmm.
And then when you got chronic illnesses, you have to adjust.
Yeah,
There's no other way. If you don't adjust, you die.
you die. Right.
Since we've been talking about death. And I think one of the most impactful things, and she might not even know this, but my therapist, we were talking one day and she was like, yeah, I'm going on hiatus and I'm going to take time for myself and self care. So
Hmm.
it was almost like, oh, my therapist is taking time to take the medicine that she prescribes to me on
Hmm.
a regular basis. So that
Hmm.
let me know like she's in the helping profession, giving up herself, taking in people's problems, providing solutions, and just listening. She even needs to kind of retreat and pour into herself and take time to decompress.
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
that kind of, and then I started thinking, well, I wonder if doctors have doctors. It's the way my mind works, and it just kind of, in terms of again navigating that perfectionist, where I had a chip on my shoulder, where I had to do everything myself. I am coming into a stage in my life where I am learning to lean into interdependence and the gift of
Mhm.
community without suspicion, which is hard, but
Mhm.
because suspicion can be strong, but I'm
Mhm.
learning nonetheless.
Mhm. Oh, that's beautiful, Maya. I really appreciate you sharing. Right, that is, yeah, I'm on a similar kind of train, trying to sort of figure myself out one day to the next, and be true to myself one day to the next, even when I'm counseling others to be true to themselves. It's a
Mhm.
wild thing how sometimes we don't take our own advice. But it
Mhm.
sounds like you are, or at least shortly, pretty darn down that road of taking your advice, and that's a beautiful thing. I just want to celebrate that, Maya. That's a rare and gorgeous thing.
I'm on a journey.
Yeah, amen. Me too.
Well, man, this has been such an awesome conversation.
Mm.
And this last question I ask everyone, and I
Mhm.
always give the disclaimer, I don't expect any type of answer. I just expect you to be authentic. And
Mhm.
that is, what or who has helped you to become better and not bitter in your life experience?
Mm. Oh, there's lots. Ooh, ooh, man. I've had so many positive examples, but I've
Mhm.
also learned a lot from the negative examples.
Mhm.
The bitter folks. I'm like, ooh, I don't want to land there. I have to say, sometimes the negative examples are some of the most powerful for me, really,
Mhm.
honestly. I've been around a fair amount of bitter folks who never kind of found their way to the peace that you're describing. Um, and boy, it's hard to be with. It's hard to see. And I can see it bubble up in myself sometimes. So I want to maybe my answer is to give a shout out to all the bitter folks, folks in whom bitterness has crept, to
Yeah.
help me see like, ooh, be careful. I
Yeah.
could go bitter. I could go bitter. I would say so. Thank you, folks who have found their way to bitterness for pointing me the way to not go, honestly. And then the
Yeah.
second answer to that question is living with, I have a dog and 2 cats.
Oh,
And watching these animals just accommodate life one moment to the next. They're not sitting there wishing. I don't think my dog is going, man, if only I had X, Y, or Z, then I'd be okay. You know, and no, she's cool with life. Just it's always. It's just she's real always. She can't not be real. And there's
yeah.
something that very inspiring about being with that kind of energy. I love it.
Yeah. Thank you for sharing. And so to those, just want to say I don't position myself as someone who has mastered anything.
Mm,
I am on a journey. That's why this is called Better, Not Bitter, and my blog is called Journey to Better.
mm,
But
mm,
I will say, for those of you who are listening, whether you have a disability or not, Dr. Miller has provided us with some awesome points and keys that I think are palatable for everybody on their journey of life, whether disability is involved in your human experience or not. So without further ado, I want to give you the opportunity to plug, as we say, any of your websites, your
mm,
mentions, projects, anything of that nature.
mm. Well, thanks, Maya. Well, and yeah, and thank you, audience. I guess I should mention the business that my partner Sonia and I started a couple years ago is called Metal Health, METTLE, metalhealth.com. It's basically online palliative care counseling and coaching. It's a safe place to come be seen and be heard. And like we've been talking today, just a safe place to come work through things and try to find a way to get right with your life. So that's what Metal Health is. That's my baby right now. That's what I'm working on. So please visit us there. And then I also, with Shoshana Berger, wrote a book called A Beginner's Guide to the End. And that's published by Simon & Schuster. And that's a very practical nuts and bolts guide of how to find your way to the end of your life with as few regrets as possible and as much joy as possible.
Mm,
Um, so maybe I'll leave it at that.
that's awesome. Well, thank you for sharing, and thank you to everyone who has watched live, and to those who will catch it on the replay. We appreciate you, and remember, as I always say, to become better instead of bitter one day at a time. And I'll catch you next time.